Hello, gang. All right, discussion five now, part two of Babel, where we're getting into some things. So, again, most of you are doing great work. I was really impressed by quite a few of you. But let me say something in general that will help you. excuse me, not just in this course or with this novel, but with literature in general. So we talk about a metaphor, right? There's two parts to a metaphor. There is the vehicle and the tenor. This is like classical rhetoric. A vehicle and the tenor, two parts of a metaphor. A metaphor is where two unlike things are compared, right? And the vehicle is the mode of that comparison, and the tenor is the thing that the writer wants to change your perception of. Okay, so we have to think of these as two-part things. So many of you wrote about silver as a metaphor, which I think is a smart instinct because it's obviously a focus of the novel. But if you say that silver symbolizes wealth, power, colonialism, then I suppose, I mean, that's true, but that's also just true in the real world, right? We could say, I'm going to lay this one on you. There's another kind, a specific kind of a figural language called synecdoche, which actually is a word that's used in the next part of our reading. Synecdoche is when a part represents a whole. Okay, so like if you say, this is kind of an old slang term, but if you say I got some new wheels, meaning a new car, you're using synecdoche because a wheel is a part of a car. If you say you're shooting some hoops, that's synecdoche because a hoop is a part of basketball, but it's where the part represents the whole. Okay, so silver, I think, in the real world, and at the time in the 19th century, is a synecdoche of colonialism, certainly, because it's just one part of a complex and vast system, but you could use silver to represent colonialism. Okay? I hope that's clear. Don't worry about the terminology. I'm just saying it's a different kind of figural language. Now, in this book, silver is certainly a metaphor, but what makes it a metaphor in this book, right? How is it different from silver in the real world? The answer to that, I hope is obvious, is magic. Why is silver imbued with magical powers in this text? And how does that magic work, right? The magic works through this power of translation. So if you're going to interpret the text in terms of a central symbol or a central metaphor, which I think is smart to do, and I'm trying to push you in that direction, then you have to read that as metaphorical. Some of you wrote in this discussion post things that were just literally true about silver or literally true about colonialism. What is Quang as an author, or what is Babel as a novel, trying to add to our knowledge of colonialism or trying to show us about the workings of these sort of worldwide systems that are centered around often Western powers? Okay, think about that. Now, I'm just going to pull out a few quotes from you that I thought made this point. Okay, um, uh, Anna said this: the question of race, ethnicity, and the role of languages are different to extricate from each other. Okay? Now, that role of language is addressing the silver. So I think that that's an important thing to notice is the ways in which things that we think of as separate are brought together in the silver bar, right? So we have the currency of the colony, an actual material resource, but we also have language in that thing, right? So that's an extra symbol in the metaphor, right? We don't necessarily think of actual silver in history as associated with language in these ways, but the magic adds that to it. We also don't maybe normally think of silver in the real world or currency in the real world as magic, but she makes it in the book literally have magical powers. Something to think about. Osman said that the silver creates or contains this contradiction, both uniting all these different countries, ethnicities into an empire, uniting as one, of having some kind of common identity or center, like the Roman Empire, or I suppose like any empire, but also exploiting. So silver at once unites and exploits these colonies. Okay, that's a contradiction. Remember, I talked about dialectics um, in another video, which means these kind of oppositions or paradoxes that ultimately produce some new knowledge or some third thing, let's say. And I think that's a great way to put that: uniting and exploiting. Um, Derek pointed out this, that the silver and the translation was about cultural assimilation and erasure. Okay, so assimilating, adding to some new identity, let's say, but at the same time getting rid of something, right? So you could see a contradictory two-part movement in that symbolic reading. And then finally, Joseph noticed, I think wisely, that the silver has the power to heal and to damage. Really important. The silver does both of those things. It heals and damages in the book. So I think what we're dealing with here, well, I hope it's coming into view. I mentioned this before, that when you assert something about meaning in any book, I think it's wise to think about the opposite of that too, because literature is not just a report, right? It's not just a scientific piece of work. It is something that uses figural language, right? Whether that be the two-part metaphor or realism, history, and fiction on top of that. There's always these two levels of things happening. So it's good for us to attend to contradictory forces in these books or contradictory readings. And by contradictory, I don't mean one cancels out the other. I mean something more productive that I would call dialectical. It's a philosophical approach or method by which we consider paradoxes or contradictions as productive. If we think of two things normally separated, but that are in tension, they'll produce another thing. I think that's absolutely happening with silver here. And the quotes that I just read from you, if that was you, or your peers, if that wasn't you, show this thing happening. Um, so here's the thing. What happens? How does the magic of the silver work, right? You have these pairs of words, right? And the magic, we are told, exists in the untranslatability, the bridge between this word and this word. That's where the magic occurs, right? What is that saying about the movement of colonialism or in our own time of global capitalism, right? What is I was in Paris in August and I went to a McDonald's, right? Or I could speak English to almost every person I met, even though I tried to speak as much French as possible to let them know that I didn't think English was more important or something. Um, but this is the same sort of movement, I think, that we see in the book, which is this assimilation and ultimately an erasure, right, of the way that these colonies move. So I think one of the things to say about the way that the magic works in the silver bars is that when the silver is an actual resource, right, that they pull from the ground and mine in different colonies and get wealthy because their colonies contain these precious metals. But the novel is adding language and translation to that so that it's saying something, the novel is saying something about the ways that currencies work on cultures, on ideas, on language, on people's minds and identities. So keep that in mind. And what is the difference between these words? What is this non translatable thing? And why is that considered magic? Or why does that imbue this commodity with magical powers? It's just something I want you to think about as we move through, because the plot will reveal. This next part of the book is really, I think, exciting and up until the end, really, because as we said, fantasy, speculative fiction is often about world building, and we have built a world and peopled it with these characters, and then these plots and intrigues are really going to come to fruition, come to what I think is an exciting climax conclusion. Um, One thing I wanted to bring into the discussion, just because I think that the novel brings it to us, is the critique of Karl Marx of capitalism, which is a famous, critique the most famous critique of capitalism in the 19th century, and one of the most influential critiques of capitalism into certainly through the 20th century. We saw many historical experiments with some of these ideas that went horribly, horribly wrong. And then the 21st century, um, there's a reassessment of the ideas of Marx in terms of things that are happening around the world now. Now, when we talk about Marx, I don't want you to think that this is about like the Soviet Union or China or Cuba. Certainly, they dealt with these ideas, but uh, Marx doesn't necessarily have anything to do with those ideas. Well, certainly not directly because he wasn't alive when they happened. But as a critique of capitalism, it's just an interesting intellectual tradition, if nothing else. And for our purposes here, it just illuminates this text. So one of the things I wanted to point out is that Marx's critique of capital is dialectical. In the Communist Manifesto, is one of his famous political works published in 1848, he talks about the ways in which capitalism is in fact dialectical because it does bring great wealth to many, many people. Certainly the owners and rulers for sure, but even citizens of these countries, their wealth is raised, their convenience is raised, the way that they live their lives is often more comfortable and more efficient, let's say, than someone under feudalism, just as an example. But it also creates suffering and exploitation, right? I'm certain that Quang is, of course, she's aware of these ideas, but I think she's using these ideas to some degree in this book. Because the thing that really made me think of it, you may know this phrase, it's from the Communist Manifesto, where he says capitalism is the opiate of the masses. And by which he meant, I think that's also a dialectical phrase, right? That opium stupefies, quiets your senses, quiets your critical logic, but it also comforts and gets you high or something, right? This'll come up in this part of the reading more. But notice that when we get into the opium parts, I think that's another symbol of, in this novel, colonialism. And I think it's maybe referencing a historical document that has famously said capitalism is the opiate of the masses. Okay, so I don't want to get too far into, like this isn't a history class. You don't have to necessarily know that history. But the reason that I'm bringing it up is to show you how to push your own literary analyses to a more nuanced direction, okay? Because some of you had good things to say about silver in the book, but it was pretty literal and just saying how silver works in the book without saying how is it a metaphor or a symbol. The way it's a metaphor or a symbol is the magic, right? And how does the magic in the novel leads us toward language? They say translation is an act of betrayal, right? How does that work? How does that work for Rami and Robin and Victoire specifically, right? As people that are from colonies of the British Empire. Think about that as we move forward and think about nuance of interpretation. Think about the contradictions that the book presents to us and how it might want us to think through those things. Okay, I think this will make our interpretations more interesting. I think you'll get more ideas out of the text. Now, the other thing I said, you could that's sort of like language and silver, right? Ethnicity and race in here. Some of you chose to write about that, and I think that you're right to think about the visuals of racial identity or ethnic identity, however you want to think of that, and the different conditions that Rami and Victoire are in compared to even Robin, who in certain lights can look white, the book says to us, because he has hybrid parents, right? And Letty, who is white, but is a woman. So she has to change her appearance, just like Victoire tries to look like a man, even though she's dark-skinned and still stands out. Letty can disguise her gender to look more male, of the 19th century definitions of gender, by the way. But the visual aspect of these exclusions, I think, is really important. And the ways in which those characters experience their own identity, and their own identity in terms of the colonial power that is now setting up their lives, making them comfortable, giving them money, right? And into this soup that we have going in the novel comes the Hermes Society, which was in the last section of the reading, but is getting more developed throughout the book. So think about that, like Hermes and the Empire are two contradictory forces that are coming together too, right? Now we could talk about them as strictly discrete, separate, opposing powers, but what if we thought of those things as different sides of the same coin, as what I'm describing as dialectical, right? I think we get a more nuanced understanding of those things coming into conflict with one another. And I think I hope it's becoming clear to you that these sorts of opposing pairs, these sort of like contradictions that lead to some new understanding, are all over this book. It's embodied in the characters themselves, in the empire itself, in the commodity of silver, in the translations, in the Hermes Society. So keep in mind this. What I began this video with was the structure of metaphor is a two-part structure, right? There's two things. And then Robin himself, two identities. All these characters having two allegiances, right? I think that if we keep our minds less grounded on one thing and thinking about these contradictions, I think that you'll end up coming to a better understanding of the novel. And I will this week have more to say about the essay that we'll write about the novel. And I'm trying to help you think about interpretations of this novel that aren't just summarizing the plot. That's the thing. Plot summary is necessary, and many of you are doing that extremely well, but we have to move beyond merely saying what happened in the book, like in a book report in high school or something, right? We got to move toward, what does this mean, right? Okay, so we're starting at this level of saying, okay, silver was a commodity in the British Empire, and this shows concentration of wealth and power and exploitation of colonies. Fine. That's a good place to start, and I'm just going to try to push that further. Okay, what about the magic and the translation of the language, right? So my comments on your thing are to encourage you, not in a fake way, because I am impressed by what you're saying, and you're saying it clearly and smartly, but I also want to keep pushing you past what you think you're capable of, or maybe past what you've thought before, so that you just get better at literary analysis. Okay, I think that should cover discussion 5. I will have more to say soon, and I hope you enjoy the third part of the book, and I'll talk to you all very soon.